Hello, I'm David Van Zummeren, and welcome to a discussion on how Jesus is a superior person. We're going to be looking at Hebrews today, and we're going to, over the next three sessions, look how Jesus is a superior person, the superior work of Jesus, and then finally, the superior life of faith of Jesus. So, as you might know, when I dive into a book of the Bible, I like to give a little bit of background on the book that we're going to be studying in the next three sessions. Primarily, we're going to be looking at Hebrews. Traditionally, we can go in and we can say who wrote the book that we're studying, when it was written, and we can get a lot of details like that. Well, Hebrews is a little bit different. Unfortunately, there's no real clear-cut information that people agree on. Several people believe that Paul wrote it, but it's just not universally accepted. And even, usually we can go to the actual text itself and determine who wrote it. So if we do that and we look at Hebrews 13, verse 24, it says, "Greet all your leaders and all the Lord's people. Those from Italy send you their greetings." So here we can see that at least the author was in Italy when he wrote this letter. And unfortunately, we don't even know who he was writing to. It's not very clear of that. But we look at 13:18. Here, let's click into Hebrews 13. Scroll a little bit up to verse 18. And here it says, "Pray for us. We are sure that we have a clear conscience and desire to live honorably in every way. I particularly urge you to pray so that I may be restored to you soon." So that's the second clue. So we now know that the author of Hebrews was in Italy when he wrote this, and also that he knew the people he was writing to, because he wants to be restored to them soon. And finally, we look at down into verse 23. The author says, "I want you to know that our brother Timothy has been released, and if he arrives soon, I will come with him to see you." So these three things, we know that he was in Italy when they wrote it. He knew the people that he was writing to, and that both the audience and the author knew Timothy. So we can get some information on that. Because some people will argue that why is it even in the Bible? We don't know who wrote it, when it was written to, who is even written to. But there's clear evidence here that it is from the first century. It was written by somebody that Timothy knew and that the first century church knew. So it is included in the Bible. And so when we go talk about timeline, we see in the Bible that it's normally included in right after the Pauline letters, and then right before the letters of all the other people like James and John and Peter. But that does not denote the time frame that it was written in. As we know, even Paul's letter is not necessarily in time order. So although we do not know those details of Hebrews, we can clearly see what the author was intending to do. And this whole letter to the Hebrews points out how Jesus Christ is greater, is a superior person, that he did a superior work while he was here, and that he lived a superior life of faith. So today we're going to look to see how he's a superior person. And we're going to compare him to two different groups of people, and then two specific people that Hebrews walks through. So we're going to look at how he was a greater prophet, how he was greater than the angels, how he was greater than Moses, and greater than Aaron. So let's dive into prophets first. The Old Testament had prophets, and they were divided into two groups, the books of the Bible. I mean, there were many, many more prophets in Israel at the time, but as far as writings of the Bible, there's two groups, the major and the minor prophets. The major prophets are the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And the minor minor prophets are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now we can quickly take a look at these books and we can see that there's a difference between the major and the minor books. And it's the volume of those books. The major books, the major prophets are just much larger books. So it really denotes the volume of writing, not necessarily that Jeremiah was a greater prophet than Jonah. You might be able to argue that, but that's not the reason that they say major and minor prophets. Prophecy is often, prophets are often thought of being predictors of the future, hence prophecy. But the first definition of prophecy in the Oxford Dictionary is the action of or practice of revealing or expressing the will or thought of God. Now we can take a look at Deuteronomy. Let's take a look at Deuteronomy 18:21. Deuteronomy 18 through 21. It says here, you may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord? If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously, so do not be alarmed. So here we see two things. One, the crowd is asking, hey, how do we know what the prophet has proclaimed is in the name of the Lord? Not necessarily what he is predicting of the future, but what he's proclaiming. Meaning, how do we know the prophet is actually expressing the will or thought of God? And the answer is, if what the prophet proclaims does not come true, does not take place or come true, then that message is not from the Lord that's spoken. So I think this is important because when we look at prophecy in the Bible is usually given as proof of the prophet or the message. It's a validation that that's from God, as we can see from here, because we can take the inverse of this, right? We can take the inverse that if what a prophet has spoken has come true or has happened, then it is from the Lord. So that's important to know. So we can say, let's apply that to another part here. Let's look at the prophet of Jonah. Specifically Jonah, well, I didn't have that in there. So we look at Jonah 3:4. Jonah began by doing a day's journey into the city, proclaiming, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Now, did that come true? Not at 40 days. Because what happened here, we read on, it says, the Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. And when Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. So what happened is Nineveh repented, right? And we all know that Jonah was not a false prophet. But when the prophets proclaim something in the future, it's not that it didn't come true. A lot of the prophecies, predictions of the future, are if-thens, right? So basically what Jonah was saying is in 40 days, Nineveh will be overthrown. And the people of that day would understand if they didn't repent, right? So that it's kind of an unspoken, assumed, understood part of what Jonah was saying. So let's take a look. So that's the prophecy is usually an if then, when they're proclaiming something against the peoples. So let's take a look in Jeremiah to see if that's really true. Jeremiah chapter 18, verses 7 through 10. If at any time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be uprooted, torn down, and destroyed, and if that nation I warn repents of its evil, then I will relent and not inflict on it the disaster I had planned. And if at another time I announce that a nation or a king is to be built up or planted, and if it does evil in my sight and does not obey me, then I will reconsider the good I had intended for it to do. So we had to look at the prophecies, predictions that the prophets are proclaiming, right? And just because they don't come true does not, we have to look to see if it was an if-then statement, right? And here in Jeremiah, he clearly says that, hey, if I say something bad is going to happen, but they repent, I'll relent. And if I say something good is going to happen, but they disobey and they follow somebody else, then, I'll take that promise away. So we have to be able to differentiate between if-then statements and true prophecy. And we also have to understand that the prophets were generally concerned more with the immediate future. I think it's easy for us to, especially if we look at Revelations or some of the prophecy in Daniel and Isaiah where it talks about the end times. It's a small part of prophecy that deals with end times. The majority of it deals with the near future and the state of Israel. So now we look at Jesus as a prophet. And we can do that in Hebrews 1 verses 2. Very clearly lays out, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. So we look at this and we can see that very clearly, Jesus has taken up the task of providing God's words to us. So he is in this fashion considered a prophet. And if we look at the first two verses here, it's not that, so as we try and say, hey, how is he considered to be a greater prophet of that? It's not that God promised him heir of all things, because he has promised other prophets also. If we look in Acts 2:29. Acts 2:29. It says here, fellow Israelites, I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here to this day. But he was a prophet and knew that God had promised him an oath that he would place one of his descendants on his throne. So here God promised David, a member of his family, to always be on the throne of Israel. So it's not that God promised Jesus something and not other prophets. It's just that here we can see that the promise is significantly more, right? He didn't just promise Jesus a descendant on a throne. He appointed him heir of all things. And we see here also that David died and he was buried. And it says here his tomb is here to this day, meaning David's bones are in that tomb still. And as we know, that's not the case with Jesus. Jesus did die. His bones were in his tomb for a brief period of time, but then he was resurrected, came back to life. His bones are no longer there. So he is a better prophet in that aspect as well, that he has defeated death. But it's interesting that even though Jesus is clearly a greater prophet than the old, he ultimately was treated the same also. So if we look in Acts 7, verse 52, it says, 52, was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And now you have betrayed and murdered him. So even the old prophets, they were persecuted, and some of them were even killed. The ones that were predicting Jesus' coming were killed. So in the same aspect, Jesus was treated the same as those prophets. He was persecuted and killed. But let's take a look at angels. And so what are angels? Angels are spiritual beings, and they're almost always messengers of God. Now, sometimes they're very clearly heavenly beings. If we look in Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 9, we see here, and there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. Very clearly, this instance of the angel in the Bible, people knew it was an angel. And there's no question about it, and people were actually terrified. Now, sometimes the references are difficult to tell the difference between an angel, them being an angel, and then just being a regular human. A lot of times the angels took on human form, as we saw in Genesis 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre. While he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day, Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing there nearby. And when he saw them, he hurried from the entrance to his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. Here we can see that the Lord was there, but there's 3 men. Abraham believed them to be 3 people. And it even goes on there to say how he fed them, and gave them hospitality. And this is when the one of the angels told Abraham that he was going to come a year from now, and Sarah would have a child, would be pregnant. And Sarah actually laughed. She heard it as she was preparing the food. And this was kind of a tense moments in the Bible as I was reading this, getting prepared for this message. I was kind of a little awkward because Sarah got a kind of a beat down from the angel. The angel said, "Why did you laugh?" And Sarah's like, "Well, I didn't laugh." And the angel said, "Yeah, you did. I mean, they didn't mess around and didn't let Sarah get away with the lie." But anyways, those 2 of those angels went down to Sodom afterwards, and they were very clearly thought of as men in Sodom, as the Sodomites wanted to, they knocked at the door and asked to have the men that just entered the city come out so they could, have some fun with them, unfortunately. And we're further have evidence that angels are often very difficult to tell the difference between an angel and a man. Because in Hebrews 13, verse 2, it says, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." So clearly, you just don't know, right? So let's always be hospitable to everybody because they might be an angel. So they did God's bidding, and angels were also lawgivers. We can look in Acts 7:53. And here it says, "You who have received the law that was given through angels, but have not obeyed it." And then also Galatians 3:19. Why then was the law given at all? It was added because of transgressions until the seed to whom the promise referred had come. The law was given to angels and entrusted to a mediator. So not only did they carry out his tasks, we can see in various different parts where, especially in the Old Testament, the angels went out in front of the army of Israel and laid waste to their enemies, but they also gave out the law. But Jesus, again, was also a messenger. He was just a greater one. And that's not just me making up stories. We can go to Hebrews 1. Clearly says, the Son, superior to angels. It's almost as if like I was reading the Bible to come up with the bullet points in my message. But here we see, for to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, today I have become your father, or again, I will be his father, and he will be my son. And again, when God brings his firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. So very clearly, God doesn't mince any words. He says that Jesus is greater than the angels, to the point where the angels are worshiping him. And in that, we can see in Hebrews 2:14, Hebrews 2:14. If I can type. Apologize for that. 2:14. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in the humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. So Jesus was a messenger greater than the angels, and he was here to serve Abraham's descendants. So why is it important that we talk about Jesus being greater than the prophets and the angels? Now, both of these groups, the prophets and the angels, worked in the service of the Lord. They gave the law to us. They carried out his commandments as he did his bidding, punishments against Israel. But we see why is it important? Continue in Hebrews 2. We'll go back a little bit to a warning message. Now, there are several warning messages in Hebrews, so let's take a look at this first one. It says, we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. For since the message spoken through the angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. God also testified to it by signs, wonders, and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. So what does this passage mean? That all the prophets and all the angels, all they did in service of the Lord was pointed to salvation. Right? I mean, it says, how are we to ignore such a great salvation of what was given to us by the angels and the prophets? So you see, God's plan isn't for us to struggle eternity in hell. It is to live in worship of him in eternity with him. So the whole Bible, it's all about all of his actions since the beginning of the time was to reconcile us to him. And as we can see that what was given to us from the prophets and the angels were good for us, and it was a great salvation. But Jesus, as we've outlined here, is greater than both of those. The message that he gives us is greater. And what he did on the cross is greater than what any of those, the prophets or the angels did. So now we've looked at, compared Jesus to two groups and shown him how he is greater than those two groups. Let's move on to individuals. And the first one we're going to take a look at is Moses. And you might say, Dave, Moses was a prophet. Why are we going to single Moses out? Like, if Jesus is greater than the prophets, then obviously he's greater than Moses. And I'd say that's a great question. And then I would answer you by looking at Deuteronomy 34, starting off in verse 10. It says, "Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of Israel." So this is why we're signaling Moses out, because God believes that, that no prophet is as great as Moses. Obviously, Jesus is, other than Jesus, right? Jesus is greater than Moses. And again, this isn't just my opinion, because that wouldn't be worth a whole lot. But if we look at Hebrews 3, verse 3, it says, Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses. Like, it's just not, my opinion. It actually says that, if we take the two passages in Deuteronomy and here in Hebrews, we can see that, hey, Moses was the greatest prophet of all time, but Jesus is worthy of greater honor. And I think it's also important that's nice here is that we're not dissing Moses. And even when we compare them to the prophets and angels, we're not saying that they were bad. We're just saying that Jesus is greater. And here we can see that that just as the builder of the house has greater honor than the house itself, for every house was built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. And it says, so, and we already read that Jesus created the universe, that through Jesus, God created the universe. But we also see here that Moses was faithful as a servant in all of God's house. Right? So again, the writers of Hebrews is paying respect to Moses, but then just elevating Jesus that much more. So why should we care that Jesus is greater than Moses? Well, we take a look at what did Moses do. He's obviously the greatest prophet outside of Jesus. He led Israel out of Egypt. Like, that's no small feat that he did there. It was a pretty big thing that he did. Parting the Red Sea, and then leading the ungrateful people of Israel for 40 years. That could have been pretty frustrating for Moses, but he did that. Those people complained, and it didn't take them very long. Almost immediately they started complaining and saying things like, "Oh, I wish we were dead. Wish that we were still in Egypt as slaves." But what did Jesus do? What Jesus did was greater. Jesus died on the cross. He defeated death. Right? Moses led people out of Egypt, but Jesus led us through death on what he did on the cross. And he led us to eternal salvation. So that's a greater act. And he was able to do that because he's greater than Moses. Now, the second person that we're going to compare him to is Aaron. And you're going to say, Dave, Aaron is the brother of Moses. And that is true. He definitely was the brother of Moses. He was the first priest, and he was the high priest during the Exodus. and the wandering in the wilderness. And it was kind of he was portrayed in two different lights. There was a positive and a negative side to what Aaron did in his life. We all remember the golden calf that he created for the people of Israel as Moses was on Mount Sinai speaking face to face with God, getting the commandments. He capitulated to the complaining of the Israelites and created a golden calf. That did not work all that great out for him. So that was kind of something not great that Aaron did. But he also did some good if we, and that also God did believe in Aaron. Thought highly of him. If we look in Exodus 4:14, this is when Moses is arguing with God about going to Egypt to free the Israelites. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "What about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you." So this great thing that Moses did, leading the people out of Egypt. And Moses was complaining to God. He didn't want to do it. He's saying, I can't speak. Now, this is just not something that I want to be good at. And God's answer is to send Aaron in there. But as a high priest, Aaron and all his descendants, they were responsible for atoning for Israel's sins. But he also had to atone for his own sins as well. As we see in Hebrews 5, chapter 5. It says here that every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for their sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. So it wasn't perfect, right? He, on one side, it says here that he's able to deal gently with the Israelites because he's walked alongside them. He knows the struggles of sin and in weakness. But he not only knows the struggles, he is a sinner himself, as we see with the golden calf and several of the other examples. So that's why he has to offer his sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. So how is Jesus a better high priest than that? Well, let's go down to Hebrews 7. Verse 27. Unlike the other high priests, and answering my own question here, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. So he was the perfect sacrifice. And it's interesting. Point here is like in Hebrews 5, it said that the high priest is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going to astray, since he himself is subject to the weakness. And I think this is one of the reasons Jesus became man. So he can also relate to us, because he didn't sin, but he was a human. He knew what it was like to be tempted. He was tempted by the devil and all the other temptations that we have here on earth. But he resisted, he was sin-free, and that's why he was the perfect sacrifice. And he only had to do it once. He didn't have to do it every year on the Day of Atonement. He did it once and for all. Now, it also says here, go back to Hebrews 5, that the high priests were selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God. And then we look down in verse 4, and it says, and no one takes his honor on himself, but receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. So this is talking to how people are selected to be a high priest. And so this is something else that Jesus does have in common with Aaron. He went through the same process. So he wasn't just magically a high priest. He actually was selected through the same process. And because it says in verse 5, in the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, you are my son, today I have become your father. And he says in another place, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So he was assigned the high priesthood by God. But we can start to see how Jesus is a little bit different here. I mean, other than that he was a perfect sacrifice. But in 5:6, it says, you're a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Now, when we, who is Melchizedek, right? Let's briefly touch on that. Melchizedek is probably a whole nother message all in itself. When we look at the Old Testament, primarily in Genesis 14 and in Psalms 110 is when Melchizedek is mentioned in the Old Testament. 18 through 20, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abram, saying, blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. And then we look at Psalm 110. In verse 4, it says, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Psalm 110 is talking about the coming of Jesus Christ. But we want to focus not necessarily on who Melchizedek is, but what are the implications that Jesus is not a high priest in the line of Aaron. He's not of the Levitical priest. He is a high priest in the line of Melchizedek. Does that even matter? He's just a high priest. But it does matter. As we can see in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 12. It says, for when the priesthood is changed, the law must also be changed. So if Jesus was in the same line of priests as Aaron, the law would have stayed the same. But we see that the law was not good enough. If we look a little bit farther down, it says the former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless, for the law made nothing perfect, and a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to God. So in verse 12, it says that, hey, if the priesthood is changed, and not just a new high priest, this is speaking to a new lineage of priests. So replacing the lineage of Aaron, the Levitical priests, with the line of Melchizedek, the law must change. And why? Why should it change? Because clearly says the old regulation law is set aside because it was weak and useless, because it didn't perfect anything. It was imperfect. If it was perfect, then Aaron, as a high priest, would only have had to do 1 day of atonement. It would not have been a yearly thing. So that is why it's important that Jesus is of the line of Melchizedek and not of Aaron. Another point is, again, this pesky little thing called death that keeps on happening. Happened to the prophets, happened to Moses, and it also happened to Aaron. And priests in general, they die. So they cannot continue serving Israel. But as we know, Jesus died, came back to life. He is still our high priest. So why is it important that Jesus is a greater priest than Aaron? We've already covered that it's the fact that, the old law needed to be replaced with a new law. But we also see in Hebrews 8:1. Now, what is the main point of what we're saying is this? Like, sometimes teaching things out of the Bible is fairly easy. Again, the bullet points I kind of take usually out of the headlines of the Bible. So what's the main point? That Jesus is a greater high priest. So we're going to get to that. The high priest offered sacrifices to God for us in the tabernacle here on earth. And it is just a earthly copy of what is in heaven. What's on earth was made by human hands, but what is in heaven, was made by God through Jesus. So Jesus beat death, and he's still the high priest, and he's still at the right hand of the Father. So not only did he serve for a little bit in the true tabernacle, he is still serving in the true tabernacle. So the whole point is the law has changed. And now we're going to get to the long reading of the message. We're going to look in Hebrews 8:16 through 13. And this is why it's important that the law has changed. But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as a covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, since a new covenant is established on better promises. For there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place. For if there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. But God found fault with the people and said, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with the ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will establish with the people of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear." So that's the whole point of why we want to point out that Jesus is greater than the high priests of old, greater than the prophets and the angels. We see here that through him the new covenant will be established. And a few key points here is that for I will forgive them their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. So this talks to, again, how the high priests had to have the Day of Atonement each each year to absolve us of our sins. And again, also had to cleanse himself of those sins. But in this new covenant that Jesus brings in, God's going to remember the sins no more, right? And as in the old law, Moses on Mount Sinai wrote on the tablets, he's going to write the new law on our hearts. So why is this important? Again, I think it's, there's definitely times when we study the Bible and it's very interesting things. We can learn history. If we go back to Chronicles and Kings and learn the lineage. So sometimes we're just studying the Bible to learn more about the history and what has gone on in the Bible. But this specifically, I want to point out that it is really important because the new covenant that Jesus did, him being a greater prophet, greater than the angels, greater than Moses and Aaron, and specifically, he's a greater sacrifice. And through that, and through being establishing a new line of high priests, he has helped bring in the new law and the new covenant, where we can have faith and hope that when we believe in Jesus Christ and what he did on the cross, in his sacrifice, where he overcame death, we no longer need to fear death, but we have a path through death and to be able to spend eternity worshiping God at his feet in heaven. So thank you for joining. If you like this message, hit subscribe, and then you can also turn on notifications so you'll know when the next message in this series hits. Have a great day.